A warm welcome to this lesson series on the introduction to the Constitution of India. In today's lesson, we will be seeing part 18 of the Indian Constitution that deals with the emergency provisions. In this lesson on emergency, we will see the following points: the concept, the three types of emergency, the conditions that are required for that specific kind of emergency, and the history of each of these types of emergency in India. So let us start with the concept of what an emergency is. So when we say that there is an emergency, what that essentially means is that things are not ordinary, right? And when things are not ordinary, it affects two things. The first thing that is affected is the federal structure of the constitution. Now, we discussed what the federal structure is. We know that the federal structure means that there are two tiers of government. There is the center as well as the state, and both of these have their own spheres of activity and they have their own lists on which they operate, their own subject matter. This is the federal structure. Now, in times of emergency, the center becomes more important than the state, and therefore the federal structure is affected. The other thing that is affected are the fundamental rights. So during an emergency, the fundamental rights get suspended, right? Of course, fundamental rights like Article 20 and 21 are not suspended, but the other fundamental rights get suspended during an emergency. That's why an emergency is really an extraordinary situation. Let us look now at the types of emergency. There are basically three types of emergency in the Indian Constitution. The first is national emergency that you find under Article 352. Then there is what is known as the President's Rule, which you find in Article 356. Then the third and final kind of emergency is the financial emergency that is there in Article 360. Let us start with Article 352, National Emergency. There are basically three grounds for which the President can proclaim a national emergency. The first is if there is a war. The second is if there is an external aggression, which means there's an aggression which is not necessarily a war. So a war basically means that India goes in war against, say, a neighbor, A, whatever country that might be, which means that both are fighting against each other. But let us say a country A comes and attacks India. Now, that's an aggression by an external country. It's not a war, because war means that both countries are now battling it out. Okay, that's the second condition. And the third condition is when there is an internal armed rebellion. So this is for internal things. So these are three conditions in which there can be national emergency. So national emergency has been proclaimed three times in India. If you look at the history, it has happened twice because of war, and once it had happened because of what Indira Gandhi considered an emergency at that point. Next, we come to President's Rule. So when we talk of Article 356, which discusses the President's Rule, basically the President can proclaim the emergency under 356 if the President is satisfied that governance in that state cannot be carried out in accordance with the Constitution. If we are to talk about the President's Rule, well, since 1951, President's Rule has been proclaimed, used, abused and misused several times. In fact, it has been applied in all of the states except Chhattisgarh and Telangana. And the reason for that is perhaps that since these are relatively new. But if you look at any of the older states, then the President's Rule has been proclaimed there. Now we talk about the third and the final type of emergency, which is the financial emergency that is discussed in Article 360. A financial emergency may be declared when there is a threat to the financial stability or the credit of India, right? So this is a situation where financially India is not in a good condition. As regards the history of a financial emergency has never been declared in the history of India. It's important for us to perhaps note that in the year 1991, India did suffer an economic and financial crisis. However, at that point, India opened up its market and adopted a liberalized economy, and then that helped revive India's economy, and therefore there was no need for a financial emergency to be declared. So I hope that you have been able to understand the three kinds of emergency as contained in part 18 of the Constitution. Basically, an emergency is a situation wherein there is an alternate way of functioning. So basically, when you're talking about the normal conditions, you have a certain kind of constitution, and then in the emergency situations, the constitution operates differently because these different needs of the emergency situation require to be met. I hope this lesson was of use to you. Thank you so much for your patience. Good day.